Hi, and welcome to InfoSec Pros. I'm Kayne, the Field CISO at Hyperproof, and I'm joined today by Bryan Fisher, the Staff Risk Manager at Ironclad. Welcome to the show, Bryan.
Thanks, Kane. It's good to be here.
Fantastic to have you on. And because this is a live stream and we have a live audience that we're apparently competing with sports ball in the Olympics, if you're watching this and you've got a question for Bryan, or if you've got a question about Ironclad or a question about Hyperproof, please drop it in the comments on either LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we'll be taking those questions live as we go for the next hour. So let's start off, Bryan, just by talking a little bit about your background, which is an interesting one. Tell the audience a little bit about your journey from being a reservist in the Army to transitioning into the cybersecurity field, and I'd really be interested in hearing like how that differs from the folks I know who were like enlisted and then transitioned out into cybersecurity. How that compares.
Sure. So I would say that my transition from the military is a little bit of a different one. Typically, people will enlist or commission directly into active duty. They'll gain relevant on the job training that way. And then, upon completion of their contract or their service, they will get out of the military. And when transitioning out of the military, they will be provided with a lot of services that help them translate their skills from what they learned in the military into civilian life. Why it's different from me is I enlisted in the California Army National Guard for about 3 years. Then I transitioned to ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, where while training to become an officer, I was also doing what are called weekend drills in the Army Reserve as an intelligence analyst. And then after commissioning, I moved into an all source intelligence analyst as an officer role. And then more specifically, I moved into what's called intelligence and electronic warfare. In the IEW space is really where I kind of found what technology is, what it can do, what its limitations are, and starting to get in the mindset of being able to understand how our adversaries or people in the red team understand technology in order to be able to influence the technology to meet whatever their objectives are. And so the problem with being a National Guard and reservist entirely meant I didn't have any deployments, meaning I didn't have any active duty time, which is roughly in order to receive a lot of the help benefits is usually about 120 days of active duty time, not training time. So I had active duty time, but it was specifically for what's called TRADOC or training command. And so when transitioning out of the military, I didn't get a lot of the same benefits as if I was transitioning from active duty into the civilian world. And so I kind of had to figure it out as I went. So to do that, I figured I need to identify and find a mentor. So I met a gentleman, great guy. His name is Tom Hammer. Shout out to him. He took me to an ISACA meeting. I didn't know what ISACA was before that. So he took me to ISACA meeting in Silicon Valley. I linked up with San Jose State's ISACA program while in my master's. And then they helped me reach out to Big Four consulting firms and kind of get my foot in the door and land a job that way. So rather than your typical, hey, I've got all of these active duty skills in cybersecurity, I was doing more of networking, building connections in order to land my first job in IT. And so I was able to get my first job in IT thanks to grad school. My grad school classmate was like, hey, I've got this position open at our company. I think you'd be perfect for it. And then I transitioned to doing identity access management. And so that was my transition. So while I was a reservist and while I was a reserve officer, I was getting on the job training by actually going to do IT risk management that way. So if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask a follow-up question. So it sounds like you spent some time, quite a lot of time actually, in the intelligence community, and I've previously hired people who are both intel and co-intel from background. And in cybersecurity, we have this idea of threat intelligence, and I think you and I
Yes.
know that threat intelligence and intelligence are very different disciplines. Can you just,
Yes.
audience, break that down, like what your perspective coming from the intel industry is to what is, the intelligence cycle and how that varies from the what we sell as threat intelligence in our industry?
So intelligence, the way the U.S. military does intelligence is through what are called ints, or different facets of intelligence, right? So there's different collection or processing methods that are used for state or national objectives versus a cyber or a company that needs to identify threats. And so these could be logical, physical, technical, or administrative controls or vulnerabilities that need controls to protect data. The US military's focus is identifying adversaries that need to um, be processed or handled, in if that makes sense. It
It
just
does, yes.
it's
Denying adversaries is a nice, quaint way
correct.
of putting it.
Yes. And so the ways to analyze how adversaries think are the same, but the outputs are totally separate. So the same way you would perform reconnaissance, the same way you would try to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited, the
Hmm.
outputs or the outcomes are different. In the military, you're trying to meet what's called your commander's end state. And that could be whatever the commander's priority is at that specific time or during that entire deployment. Versus the company, their objective is to ensure the security of both their organization as well as usually their customers' data. So the thought process for how you go about it is very similar, but
Hmm.
again, the objectives we're trying to read are totally separate.
But do you think that that mindset that veterans and also well, veterans, and whether they're reservists or whether they're active duties, do you think that that mindset of understanding the commander's intent and the end state that they're looking for really maps onto the cybersecurity industry?
Yes, because if you just change commander's end state and you put in company's objectives, then you're using the same standardized process you've been taught in the military, but your outcome is different. So I like to think of I love ISO's definition of risk. It's the effect of uncertainty on your company's objectives. So whether you're performing cybersecurity threat intelligence, right?
Hmm.
You can't be doing it willy-nilly, in the sense that I can't just start identifying thousands and millions of threats, because if most of those don't meet my company's objectives, then I'm putting in effort in places that I necessarily shouldn't. I should focus my resources, because in the corporate world, resources are usually very limited. And so
Hmm.
I need to focus my limited resources on meeting my company's objectives. And so that's how I think there's the difference. Again, we do use the same standardized process, but at the outcome is different.
Yeah. I wanted to also ask on just transitioning out. A lot of reservists and a lot of active duty military go into certification programs.
Yes.
Was that offered to you by your, oh gosh, I'm about to use a term here, lever? You and I know what a lever is, local veterans
Yeah.
employment representative. Were you put
Yes.
into a certification program in that way?
No. Nope.
Oh,
I
okay,
was
really?
not. Um, I was not put into it. There again are requirements for them. I, in most instances, have to be put on orders to attend certain trainings. And if my job description or job duty isn't associated or isn't aligned with those trainings, then it's less likely for me to go get those certifications. So, doing electronic warfare, um, is similar to cybersecurity in the sense that you have to understand the electromagnetic spectrum,
Hmm.
but it wasn't necessarily my job to go protect the electromagnetic spectrum or the infrastructure or the systems themselves. That was a separate role and responsibility in the US Army, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, no, that does. So you didn't get certifications like a lot of the folks that I do, and I want to tuck into this because I know certifications are often seen as the benchmark for why you'd hire somebody. That it's it's like when my kids were young, there used to be these things outside the roller coasters that you have to be this tall to ride, and if you were this
Yes.
tall, you just didn't weren't
I mean,
allowed
those
on.
things still do exist as a heads up.
No, that is true. Even though my kids are probably well, one of them's almost as tall as me. Can you imagine that? But what do you think really of the certifications, like as being a way of ensuring that somebody's skilled enough to do their job? Is that true?
I would say yes and no. I think security certifications or certifications in general help a new person that you're going to communicate with understand what concept you or what level of knowledge you know.
Hmm.
It's just a way to move past a basic set of knowledge. But I don't think certification should be a requirement for certain roles because if you have the experience and you're okay having that initial conversation to prove that you understand the material and you're competent in your job, you can show, hey, I've got X amount of years doing these specific types of roles. These are my responsibilities. I was still able to lead teams. I was still able to provide value to the organization or cost cutting measures. Hiring a person like that is still, I would rather have the individual that has the experience without the certifications than hiring someone solely who has certifications and not necessarily the same level of experience, me personally.
Okay, all right. So I'm asking because this morning I was planning. Well, I am going to ISACA GRC, and then later this year I'm going to what is it, ISC Squared Security Congress. And you go to these things and you meet people with just an acronym soup behind their name, where
Yes.
it's like they have 4 or 5 different certifications that they rep, and you look on their LinkedIn profile and you're like, wow, that is just alphabet soup there. And all of those certifications have got a cost, right? Every
Yes.
one of those certifications. A good friend of mine also is a Cisco, has all of the Cisco certifications, and he spends a lot of time and a lot of his own money keeping those certifications up to date. Do you think that's got value, really? Like, especially, I can see how the recurring fees have value for the certification issuer, but do they actually, in your perspective, have value to the certification holder?
I, in my personal view, if you obtain a certain certification, I think you should maintain that for life. Now, that's just me.
Hmm.
Uh, and I don't think an individual should be paying dues. I believe your organization should be sponsoring you, saying, "Hey, our individual, this employee of ours, it has gone above and beyond, and we want to ensure as we sell our service or product, we can show and maintain, hey, our organization maintains X level of security because of our staff, not vice versa. So I don't want to make a requirement for someone to go get a certification if they're not comfortable going to get that certification. I'd rather have the individual maybe go take the boot camp to understand the material and bring that back to train us on rather than having that person pay out of pocket for each different organization that maintains certifications. Now, to be fair, there are some certifications that I would say require additional follow-ups, right? So maybe you're a CPA, for example, and there's new legislation or laws you need to be trained on in order to ensure you're providing your company's best interests with
Hmm.
relates to upcoming laws and regulations. I wholeheartedly understand that. Then it should still be on the responsibility of the organization, in my own humble opinion, to cover the cost of that certification and new training, and because that person is still a resource to the organization, rather than the other way around, if that makes sense.
No, that totally does. And part of what I was thinking of a story you and I were talking about before we got on, but like just to put a bow on the certification thing, uh, one of the companies that I was at where we were doing audits and assessments for companies, that was just a de facto standard that because we were an audit and assessment and consultancy, we were, from a corporate perspective, we were making money based on people having certifications. And the reason that we could get them in contracts is because they had those certifications, like a CPA or a similar certification, that could show, like, hey, this is actually a real, alive auditor you're going to be able to talk to. Can you imagine that? And so we would absolutely pay for their certifications. Whereas I think you're right, a lot of companies don't. There's just an inherent cost that's put on people, which I can imagine, especially if they don't have like what the military transition for active duty is, where they're put into like a 12 or 16 week boot camp and they get a certification out at the end. They don't have that advantage, and so it creates a cost for prospective employees even to get into the cybersecurity or the GRC industry.
Yes, and there are a plethora of ways that, thankfully, now that I know what I know and am where I am, that many organizations, large organizations, provide certifications at low cost, thankfully.
Hmm.
So, for example, you want to get an understanding of cloud infrastructure. Well, we know the big three names in cloud infrastructure, and each of them has certifications, but each of those certifications are about $100, which is great. You could take relatively inexpensive courses online to prepare you for the exam. You could use services usually from those cloud infrastructure organizations for hands-on practice before
Hmm.
you go take the exam. And then once you have those certifications, then it helps you to understand what problems companies face when using those solutions.
Hmm.
The other thing with certifications is that I the more expensive ones, when an organization pays for you to go to those more expensive trainings, because they have more funding, they're typically on the bleeding edge of trainings and techniques. And yeah, so for the more expensive certifications and boot camps,
Hmm.
um, at least the ones I've attended, the trainings themselves provided a lot of value that I could immediately bring back to my organization and say, here are the tools, techniques that people are using against new and innovative technologies that didn't exist, say, like a year ago or 2 years ago. And so I see the need to continuously send security personnel to trainings, but I wouldn't want someone to spend additional energy and possible stress to study for a certification exam. I'd rather have that person go to the course, take the knowledge, bring the knowledge back to the organization so that we can then maintain a high level of security as well as understanding of new and innovative threats that we may not be tracking as of today.
All right, and I want to thank our audience for. I think we've managed to touch a nerve with the audience. I want to
Oh
thank our
no.
audience for submitting questions, and please do keep submitting questions. This is a live show, after all. The first question is from Magnus, and thank you, Magnus. If you are from the Magnus Archives, hi. If you're not from the Magnus Archives, that is a podcast that nobody should be listening to. It's very spooky. But the question from Magnus is, do you believe there's a shortage of people in the security industry?
Is That's a great question,
Great loaded
Magnus.
question, isn't it?
It is a great loaded question, Magnus. I think there is a shortage. I believe there is and there isn't. I think there is a shortage of security personnel, but I don't think companies have realized how impactful security professionals can be in an organization. So I think we need way more security professionals across the entire world to ensure that companies have the level of protection, they understand the risk, and the risk definition again is the effect of uncertainty on your organization's objectives. Most organizations want to be profitable, they want to be large, they want to be global, and with all of those factors brings new additional risk that requires qualified security professionals in order to support. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect, at least what I'm seeing in the market, between what companies should be focusing on and the number of qualified professionals. I believe there's a large pool of professionals that are looking for employment, but companies have not caught up to the need of whatever their objectives are in order to provide a strategic approach to cybersecurity as a whole.
And you've raised
Hopefully, I
actually another
answered.
follow-up question there. So this is a question from Steve, and it says it seems like every security position wants a CISSP, and there are less than 200,000 certified CISSPs globally. Do you think that companies have realistic expectations? Now, I could easily get on a soapbox here about that whole thing, but mostly as it relates to CISOs. Where do you come down on this one? Is that a realistic certification to ask for?
No, I don't think it is, because I have taken the CISSP and I do not hold a CISSP. I did not pass my certification exam because most of my experience is in governance, risk, and compliance, not necessarily engineering, not necessarily infrastructure, not necessarily in pen testing, for example. There are a lot of domains that I just don't have the relevant experience in, and rogue memorizing a book isn't going to provide enough value for me to obtain the certification. Does that make
I'm
sense?
laughing because I'm thinking ASTM gates and concrete bollards. That's where
Yes,
my head
right.
immediately goes to.
Right.
Yep.
And I just don't have the experience, and you can't fake the experience on an exam, right? Now, should everyone go to a CISSP boot camp? 100%. Go to the boot camp. And the reason I would go to the boot camp is to identify the places where you are missing gaps, where you're missing that knowledge, because we don't know what we don't know. So going to the course will show you where you have those gaps. So then I know what things I should study to become a better or more well rounded cybersecurity professional, if that makes sense.
No, that does. And Steve, thank you for that question. Magnus, thank you for that question as well. I'll thank the audience. Please do keep dropping questions in the chat. And before we move to our next topic, I will just rep cyberseek.org. That's the word cyber, the word seek, SEEK.org. And they have really good vendor agnostic national level, at least in the continental United States, view on here's what certifications are, here's which certifications get jobs, and here's which certifications are actually in need. So I would go there if you have further on there. But Bryan, I want to go back to a conversation you and I had right before we got on the show. And we were talking about audits and assessments, and you said that you had an auditor who used the word risk 167 times. I took a note of that in a 1 hour conversation, which to
Yes.
you raises a red flag, which to me wonders how many words they speak per minute, because that's pretty good clip to get like 167 times in there.
Yes.
What does so much of an overemphasis of the word risk indicate to you about that auditor?
So it really outlines what I think is two possible routes. One is that person is certification heavy, meaning they went into an organization, that organization had a large training budget, and that person just went heavy on certifications, which is not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
What that does is, again, it gives you that book of knowledge, but without the experience component, you're still missing the gaps, right? For example, with the CISSP, I was missing clearly some pieces from security that I just didn't grow up with, right? I just didn't have that experience. The other is understanding what risk is. So again, I keep harping back to the effect of uncertainty on objectives, right? So it's understanding what someone is uncertain about. If a person during an audit is like, hey, what does risk mean to you as an auditor? And I would always turn it around. Well, what are your company's objectives? What are you trying to meet? And during the audit and assessment, I would say, hey, I've reviewed your evidence. I think, based on my experience, you're strong here and your organization is weak here. Not that you're going to fail the audit, not that you're going to get a qualified report, but letting you know, based on my certifications, based on my experience as an auditor, I think your organization could, for next year, shore up these ends. And so what that tells me of using the word risk 167 times is that you're probably missing that experience to understand and work to help your customer. Because your customer is going through the audit. In most instances, you're working with security compliance folks that have a wealth of knowledge themselves. Maybe they came from Big Four themselves, they have their own certifications. And so they understand. What you're trying to achieve. But at the flip side, if they have the experience, they can quickly tell if you don't have the experience. So the problem with the individual that the our auditor provided us was
Hmm.
that we felt that they weren't as mature to be by themselves during the audit. I would have taken the approach of saying, hey, you're a senior consultant. I would recommend at least coming with maybe another senior or manager to say, hey, this person is work. I'm going to have them lead the audit and I'm going to sit in the background and I will be here to support that senior in case questions arise or I feel they're focusing on maybe the incorrect thing and try to steer the conversation to support that senior
Yeah.
rather than the seniors solely being on the audit themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it feels like, you got the person who they brought their clipboard and they've got their
Yes.
questions that the senior auditor has written out.
Right.
And like, to me, I think of like when I had junior associates or when I had associates or just, and people who are just getting into audit and assessment, you'd give them the rote list of questions and then you'd have somebody senior review those. But you're saying this was a senior person who used the word risk that much. Is that where you just panic and go, like, wait a second, we need to go find ourselves a new auditor because we think this is going to be perhaps not the most accurate or useful audit?
The As the customer, we really were disheartened with the auditor. We felt like maybe they weren't giving us their best. Now, I understand that audit firms place resources based on their qualifications, because again, he had lots of certifications, as well as um, taking the time to evaluate who the customer is, right? So on the call was me, a teammate who has a CISSP and a bunch of other certifications, as well as our director who has CISSP and a bunch of certifications. And we felt like the auditor wasn't wasn't trying to provide the value we needed because we as an organization wanted an auditor to come in and say, hey, like we had said, we see that you're strong here, you're weak here. Here's where we think you should focus for the next year. Because that's what an audit should be about. An
Hmm.
audit should be ensuring that the auditor who has the knowledge, who may be able to take all of those trainings we talked about previously, maybe thinking about new and innovative threats that we may not be taking into consideration. So the auditor should be informing us, hey, you're in these regulations day in and day out. what are we missing? There's got to be something. No organization is perfect, and it's very difficult to have zero risk in an organization. You might
That's
have
very
low
true.
risk,
Yeah, yeah.
but you have
You're not going to get risk down to zero. Well,
right.
I want to read a couple comments from the audience. And again, thank you to the audience for being engaged today. I think we might be doing better than sports ball in the Olympics, which I guess they're doing a parade on the river. Something like that. Hopefully that's going well for them. But there's a comment from Sam here that says, I look at the certification and hold certs the same way as a bachelor's degree. Every kid out of college still needs to be trained on their job, and the degree cert means that you knew your starting point and what they should already know. I think that is a good point. Thank you, Sam. There's a follow-up
Excellent.
comment from Magnus that said, I was thinking of the concrete bollards too. That knowledge won't help me, but I had to know it for the CISP. I will challenge you, Magnus, on that one. I can think of one of the first security assessments that I did was at a government agency, and I won't say who, and they just got themselves a brand new DEC Alpha. And for those of you in the audience who don't know what a DEC Alpha is, it's a type of computer. It was about the size of a washing machine, and they put it on casters in their front hallway of the lobby of their office, and their office had this wonderful manicured lawn. It had an ADA compliant ramp leading up to the front door, and the front door was not made out of shatterproof glass. And I walked in, I was like, do we really actually need to have this conversation? Because I could back a pickup truck up here and steal your data center out of your front room. Like, are you kidding me? So there is a reason for knowing about those concrete bollards, although it is for a limited scenario. And then the final question we have is from Rocky. Other than CISP, what other basic security certifications would one need who doesn't have an experience in security? Why don't you take this
I
one first, and I'll have a second go at it.
I really, and this might be taboo, I really, really like CompTIA certifications because Security Plus will give you the same intro domain knowledge as CISSP. Network Plus will give you how organizations as a standard should work and treat network. And so you're able to use those two basic certifications to kind of figure out what do you want to do. My recommendation for where do I start is try everything. First, please try engineering and coding. Please try Python. If you like it, you'll flourish very well in cybersecurity. If you don't like it, but maybe you like the data analysis portion, then you can pivot towards focusing on data and analytics or data analysis work. If you don't like any of those things, then move on from there to try those big three certification, those big three cloud organizations. Try cloud engine or cloud works. Or apologies, solutions architecture. Right. Try the certified cloud practitioner certifications. Try to understand what exists across the globe. Then from there, it'll give you enough domain knowledge to kind of figure out, well, what do you like to do? It took me, I would say, about 6 years to realize that I like cyber risk management. And then from there, a couple more years of doing it to like governance, risk, and compliance. And so where I am now is my job, the way I see GRC, and we can pivot to this later, is my job is to enable my organization to sell into any market that they want to sell to, because I'm supposed to be the subject matter expert in
Mm-hmm.
all things governance, which is building the guardrails for the organization. We've already discussed what I define risk as, and then ensuring that we meet regulatory requirements.
You know, you've just brought up some of my favorite topics on the planet. So let's move to that about GRC maturity and program effectiveness. Although I will tell the audience, if you still have questions for us, please do keep dropping them in the chat. We will keep taking them as we get them. So you've been doing GRC for a hot minute. I've been doing GRC for a hot minute. In your perspective, how do you approach measuring the effectiveness of an overall GRC program in an organization? And you know, are there any metrics, any KPIs, any indicators that you'd really find to be revealing to say, hey, this company is doing GRC well?
Sure. The one of the big ones I've seen, there's two, is your company meeting your company's objectives? Because in order to meet those company objectives, you probably have to meet some industry standard, some security framework. You have to have an independent auditor, whether that is for a penetration test or for a SOC report or an ISO audit. So some independent third party coming in and saying that you provide reasonable assurance. That's one thing. The other is quantitative data. And what I mean by quantitative data is, how do I tell my leadership as well as the board the dollar values of not doing something?
Hmm.
So, business continuity, disaster recovery. Can I associate dollar values to those things? If a disruption event occurs within our product or solution, how much money do we lose?
Kind of
And
like what
by
happened last Friday, just not to pick on any specific things that happened
Sure,
recently,
it
but
could
I
be
think a lot of
anybody.
companies that might not have had a disaster recovery plan that had been practiced lately might have had a bad
Yes.
time, yeah?
Yes. And by associating dollar values, more people across your board will have a better understanding of the value your GRC program brings to being able to support and enable your organization to thrive. That's where I see a mature organization. Quantitative data and everything else, being able
Okay.
to meet your organization's objectives.
And so then thinking about GRC program maturity, how would you prioritize improvements to improve or to achieve higher maturity levels in a GRC program at an organization?
Data. Two things: data
Okay.
and visibility. I need to be comfortable. I need to have visibility into everything that could possibly be a risk. Now, that sounds like a lot because it is. An
Hmm.
organization, especially in the cloud or maybe on prem, there are a lot of ways that risk occurs. It could be configuration problems, like an organization that recently had one, who knows? It could be container problems. It
For those of
could
you who are
be,
not following somehow, we're talking about CrowdStrike. Just in case
yes,
you somehow missed the internet last Friday, this is the CrowdStrike
yes.
thing we're talking about there.
So it could be configurations, it could be code itself, it could be IT assets, it could be human resources. I need to have visibility into everything my organization cares about. So the first thing I do in a mature organization is understand and identify across my organization, across the enterprise, what is most important to the leader of that department or team. Once I understand what they deem to be most important, as long as those things that they deem to be important align with the company's and organization's objectives, I now know what the baseline is. So I have visibility into the baseline. I can't solve a problem I am not aware of. So if something abnormal happens outside of the baseline, I know that there is uncertainty there that I need to go address, meaning I need resources, whether that is technical capabilities
Hmm.
or those security professionals we spoke about earlier who are human resources that companies haven't realized they need yet. So as a GRC team, I need to ensure that my organization understands the risk, especially if those risks, I'm going to use that a lot,
Yeah.
are humans, the deficient in humans. We've realized a strategy, for example, to maybe move to um, South America or expand into South America. Well, it would be beneficial to have security resources who understand the language, who understand the cultural norms, who understand how to be personable, what the do's and don'ts in that specific region are. And those tie back to hiring veterans who have deployment experience in those specific areas and cultures and speak those languages and are also trained in how to identify, analyze, evaluate, and treat security threats to bring into the organization.
I love that you just brought it right back to the top. I
Indeed,
love that
full
that happened there.
circle.
That was fantastic. Yeah, so I want to keep on this though, because you've mentioned some ideas of measuring GRC program effectiveness, and I love that you've defined the idea there should be a team, because I still meet the occasional person that thinks that GRC is some problem that's just going to be solved, and if you get the right tool, you're going to magically solve GRC. And I think anybody who spent any time in cybersecurity, that sounds awfully familiar, right? Where for a long time, business leaders thought, "Oh, this is just an IT problem that we're just going to magic our way through. It's a product. It's not a process. It's not a project. Rather, it's just a check the box and move on." Which it's not. But I want to ask, so if you're measuring your effectiveness of your GRC program, Bryan, how would you align that with a GRC maturity model? And do you think there'd be benefits in doing that?
Yes. In a maturity model, it usually, hopefully, comes with benchmark data for industries that you reside in. So, in the hope of having a well defined benchmarking solution or framework, I, as an organization, can use the data and metrics I currently process or have in order to see where do I stack across my industry
Hmm.
for GRC. Am I spending enough money on my security team? Am I not spending enough money on my security team? Are we spending too much money on solutions and not enough money on human resources, or vice versa? Um, it really, GRC or an organization, it's difficult for organizations to look internally, look at themselves. We want to measure our growth in dollar values of how well the organization is doing. But sometimes you have to look internal to yourselves as well as internal to your teams and actually have your leaders assess, are we doing everything that we need to be doing internally? Am I meeting my departmental objectives? Am I meeting my strategic and organizational objectives? And if I'm not, do I have the data to back it up to say to my leadership, hey, we're not meeting this. I feel as a leader that I can't provide the best level of security, and here are the deficiencies. And where am I pulling this data from? From a GRC benchmarking solution. I'm
Hmm.
able to say, hey, against everyone in our industry, here's where we sit. Maybe we're very low, maybe we're right on the mark. But even if we're right on the mark, most organizations, as we've spoken about, are trying to grow. And because we're trying to grow, we need to grow our security teams alongside with the organization itself.
Yeah, and I love that you've got cohort analysis in there as well, because when I was doing executive advisory prior to joining Hyperproof, that was one of the things that every CISO and every board that I talked to they wanted to know, first of all, how are we doing? And second of all, how are we doing compared to those companies that are like us? Because nobody wants to be spending, it's kind of like running away from the bear. You don't need to
Yeah.
be leading the pack, but you certainly don't want to be the person in the rear. They always
Yes.
wanted to be in that mushy middle where they kind of blend in, and so they don't get lawsuits and they don't get regulatory and they don't get called up in front of Congress on the Hill, because that sucks. But nobody really wanted to say, hey, like, we want to be the market leader because we have just endless money and resources. That was a material concern both across GRC as well as cybersecurity. I love that you've got that logic built in there. And I will also say this, on August 1st, I'm actually hosting a webinar. We'll drop a link in the chat notes here, and as well as in the show notes. But I'm hosting a webinar about the GRC maturity model that I wrote, and it was peer reviewed by nice people like Bryan. So we will put a link in the show notes so that people can register, and that one will also be pre-recorded in case you miss it.
I think something that is also overlooked is how do I measure what I'm getting my data from? So I understand how our organization is doing in the market, but how do
Hmm.
I know I'm collecting all of the appropriate data to ensure I am meeting those benchmarks?
Hmm.
So where are your data sources coming from? Are you sure you're collecting everything? Because maybe you're missing data sources that puts you ahead of everybody else, or vice versa, you're missing data points that put you behind other people or other organizations. And so I do my best to continually ask, do I have visibility into everything? Because as an organization, as an individual, as a team, we can't solve problems we're not aware of, is my 2024 motto. If I don't know it exists, I can't solve it.
I think that's very true, and I think also just to put a final pin on that one on data analysis, although it's going to possibly come into our final topic. I think it's necessary to automate as much of that as possible as well, to automate the ingest and the testing of it, to because something we forgot in GRC somehow for years, we had a collective forgetting that computers can copy files and that
Yes.
API calls are not magic. And I think that if you can automate that at scale with a tool like Hyperproof, that it gives you an advantage in understanding what's going on real time, as opposed to having to wait for somebody to send a screenshot or generate an Excel or something else that is manual. And like nobody gets up in security and gets excited to say, hey, I'm going to send a piece of proof that shows the firewall was working today, and I'm going to do that tomorrow, and I'm going to do that the next day, and it's going to be great. Nobody gets stoked about that. So we should definitely be automating that. But now
Yes.
that's going to bring us to our final topic, where you're hearing this. We've been hearing about artificial intelligence and data analysis and GRC for a while. And let's start at the very top here. How do you see AI transforming or improving third-party risk management? Because you seem to be very knowledgeable and interested in risks. How do you see,
Yes.
do you see AI helping with TPRM?
I do see it helping with TPRM. Where I see a disconnect currently is in internal risk. So, an organization, and I personally am trying to move away from VSQs, the Deadly Vendor Security Questionnaire.
Thank you.
And
Please keep doing that. They suck.
yes, they do. And because an organization has a SOC 2 report, an ISO 27001 cert, maybe they'll provide me the statement of applicability. Maybe you have a QSA sign off on your PCI DSS, right? Some independent third party has already done a lot of the due diligence. Now, I will send questionnaires on two specific occasions. I will send a questionnaire if your SOC 2 doesn't tell me, for example, what TLS protocol you're using, right? So if you're
Hmm.
using TLS 1.0 or 1.1, which has been deemed insecure, not broken, but deemed insecure. So I would follow up and say, well, please tell me exactly which protocols you're using. That way, I'm only sending a handful of maybe 5 or 10 clarifying questions that weren't answered in your report. The flip side is if an organization is new or has an immature program and doesn't have all of the reports, I'll send the full questionnaire as a mitigating control with the request that once you are SOC 2 Type 2 or you have your ISO cert, that you'll provide that to me so I can review it and ensure that you're still providing reasonable assurance. So there are organizations that'll have a SOC 2 Type 1 and are currently in their audit period and don't have a Type 2 yet. I'll send that 100-question questionnaire or whatever it is to ensure that they're still able to provide reasonable assurance. Then I'll reassess once they receive that Type 2 report to ensure they're still unqualified and providing that reasonable assurance.
Okay, all right. And I want to take a follow-on question from Steve from the chat, and I want to thank our audience. Like, please do keep asking questions. Love this level of engagement. This is super exciting. Um, The question from Steve is, when you're quantifying risk, are you using the risk formula or some other methods? And Bryan, I think in your answer, you should first of all define what is the risk formula.
Yes, that is likelihood times impact equals risk. Um, Now, I currently use that for how I'm measuring risk. And the reason is I want to work smarter, not harder. So, as we are all small dynamic teams, I need to have a industry proven formula that works to be able to assess risk, because I can then use similar data for benchmarking. If I use an obscure or maybe a different mathematical formula, I may not get the same benchmarking data, right? I'm not going to be able to show my organization where do I stand across our specific industry. And so I use likelihood times impact. Now, what that puts the burden on me is to train my teammates and coworkers. How do we quantify likelihood? How do we quantify what an impact is? And with impacts, I try to associate dollar values. So
Mhm.
because everyone can understand, by not doing X you lose X amount of money, then most leaders as well as board members who are not cybersecurity professionals themselves can take that into consideration. And so they're and while then also providing the same benchmarking data, it's a little bit easier to digest. Maybe as I grow as an organization and I get more GRC benchmarking frameworks that I can use that don't use the risk definition of likelihood times impact, I'd be happy to review those and implement it. But currently, that's what I use.
All right. Well, I think that was a great question for the audience, so thank you for that. I want to go back to our talk about artificial intelligence, and you were starting to talk a little bit about third-party risk, but you also said you saw some opportunities inside of companies where AI could potentially help GRC. So what are those gaps that you could see?
So, I, as a GRC professional or risk manager, I want a solution that can act as a teammate.
Hmm.
So a lot of organizations are using generative AI to spit out answers. What I would love is, because when I'm identifying a risk in, say, our risk committee meetings, it's free text. What I would love an organization to, or a tool to do, is take my free text and and automatically pull in what controls are in scope for my free text, aligned with the frameworks that are in scope for my organization. And currently, I'm having to know all of the controls across all of the different frameworks, and most of the time manually associate those controls to the free text that I've identified and created. Does that make sense?
That does, yeah. I can see your point. I think that the counterpoint there is going to be the concern of providing all of your control data, uh, specifically implementation statements, to an AI. Right? Like
True.
I know a lot of CISOs who are setting up internally hosted or Azure hosted or private tenants of AI. I could see that as being viable, but I don't think I want to tell ChatGPT, "Hey, here's my entire controls. Go have fun with that."
That is true, but it depends on the risk appetite of an organization, but it also depends on the resources. If an organization has a large security team, then I don't necessarily need an AI solution to do that for me. But for
Hmm.
smaller teams, if I go on PTO, for example, and there is no additional risk person or someone who has the same background as I do, the organization could be at a loss as they're continuously assessing risks. And so it just depends. I love the terminology of it depends on the situation. And for me, I feel that I could benefit or will always benefit from a different set of eyes as we're approaching to understand all of GRC. Now, would I be love a internal solution developed in hosted internally to take statements that I'm making and automatically associate that? 100%. Because the more visibility, more access to data means that on the very end of reporting, I'm providing more detailed value so that my decision makers can make the right decision at the right time. If that helps.
Yeah, no, that does help. I think there's definitely not a right answer on that one.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've heard companies really get wrapped around the axle on is governance of AI. Like I was saying, there are CISOs sometimes that want to do a private tenant, or they want to do an exclusive agreement with OpenAI or with Hugging Face or with like Cloud or any of the others. From your experience, there are a couple AI governance frameworks out there. There's NIST AI RMF, and then there's ISO 42 some and change, 42,001 maybe.
Yeah.
Anyway, the audience can tell me how horrifically wrong that number is that I just made up. But
Yeah. You were right,
do
I
you see
believe.
any? Oh wow, okay, I pulled that out of
That was
nowhere.
right.
So do you see any big differences right now, like between why an organization would pick ISO for AI governance versus NIST for AI governance? Because to me, that just feels like a domestic versus international flavor. Like ISO seems to be
Yeah.
very prevalent in the EU, and NIST seems to be prevalent in the United States and North America.
I think it depends, right?
You could be a consultant when you grow up.
I
My
could be a
goodness.
consultant. Uh, uh, I would study both. Even if your organization isn't going to be selling to US federal agencies, for example, I would, and if you're an ISO heavy shop, I would start with 42001, right? Or whatever the AI ISO framework is. Review it, and then go, once you have your idea of what your program will look like in place, then go to NIST AIRMF, because NIST AIRMF is extremely detailed, and it may provide additional value that 42001 may not have thought of, for example. The other thing is that AI frameworks are just going to continue to exist. And there's going to be new and innovative vulnerabilities that we weren't even thinking a year ago. And so by continuously reviewing frameworks, you're going to see how the writers of those frameworks view AI, how they themselves want to assess AI, and they want then in turn, that it determines how you may view AI. Maybe you're for it, maybe you're against it, but your job in GRC is still enable the organization to sell into the markets they want to sell, which means you as a GRC professional needs to know the thought process of the people that wrote the frameworks. What are they interested in? What are they looking for? That way you can inform your organization on the methodologies, the languages they're using, the threats and vulnerabilities, the possible new and innovative exploits. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up on where we are in the state of AI and GRC. And at this point, Bryan, I see we've gone for an hour. We could probably have gone longer, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want to thank you for being on the show today. And if you're watching this and you know somebody who should be on the show, or alternatively, if you're like, hey, I'm that person who should be on the show, drop me a note in the comments or just DM me directly on LinkedIn. And I'll say this, if you're free on August the 1st, please join our live overview of the GRC maturity model, which we'll be hosting on, I think that's on our Bright Talk channel. But with that, Bryan, I really want to thank you again for joining us. I want to thank the audience for tuning in. I know we were competing against Olympic sports ball and parades. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in on today's live stream.
Thank you for having me.